This is our second seminar in the INAT series of webinars geared toward providing people with a better understanding of INAT, a better understanding of our work, a better understanding of various aspects of appropriate technology. As the slide indicates, I'm Professor John Trimble, President of the International Network on Appropriate Technology, a retired professor from both Howard University and Tshwane University of Technology in South Africa. And the topic that we're covering today is conquest mentality and military technology, what we must do. That should also be what we must know and what we must do. So the topics we're going to cover, we're going to start with some fundamentals about appropriate technology, a little background and history on INAT, and then the focus is going to be the history of conquest and how that's been related to the development of military technology. And we're going to go beyond just its relationship to military technology and talk about the extensive nature of conquest mentality that goes beyond military. We're there going to spend a little time talking about policy changes that are needed in terms of shifting away from this conquest mentality. We're going to look briefly at how that relates to the decolonization process, both within the university and beyond the university, since most of us are or have been academics, and then look at alternatives to military spending. So to focus first on appropriate technology, INAT defines appropriate technology as technology to empower people. And we see is the importance of technology, research, development, and deployment, focusing first on basic needs. There are just too many people who don't have clean water or sanitation, that are short on food. So first looking at how technology can focus on providing food, shelter, water, energy, education, health, communication, and transportation, these basic human rights to all of the people on our planet is what we see is very, very important. Technology, techniques must relate to a people's culture. So we realize that advancing technology and techniques in different areas have to be culturally sensitive, but they also must be ecologically sound because we have to take into account the planet we live on. And we want them also to be economically sustainable. We can't look at technology that's going to exhaust a budget or exhaust other resources and be unsustainable. We focus also on utilizing local resources, both human resources and the natural resources in an area, recognizing that this reduces transport costs. It empowers the local community by using their resources, human and natural, and it naturally also reduces CO2 emissions because you don't have to rely on transport from distant areas. So these are some of the fundamentals that we have associated with appropriate technology. INAT, as we refer to ourselves, focuses on these four areas. You see the first being seminars and conferences. Before we started, Gada was talking about our next international conference on appropriate technology, which she is the international chair of the committee. And this is something, a biennial conference internationally that we organize every 2 years. This is part of the seminar series that we have launched last month. But we're also expanding our website to be a web portal that will address a range of areas with regards to appropriate technology. The third item you see that we deal with is appropriate technology projects. We funded projects in Kenya, Benin, Sudan, and in Nigeria in the past, and we look to do more in this area. The last item is about impacting technology policy. This seminar is to engage people so that they have a better understanding of the appropriate technology and will also become more engaged in policy advocation and policy change. With regards to policy, we're concerned with it on all levels and in all engagements, from the international level to multi-country agreements to bilateral agreements. Many of us are in different nations and to look at the national level in terms of policy, provincial, regional, and city policies within our nations. And because most of us have been academics, we're looking also at the technology policy within universities and other institutions. As I mentioned, this is the second in our international Zoom seminars. Last month, we focused more broadly on appropriate technology and what that meant and what INAT was dealing with. This one, we're focusing particularly on conquest mentality and military technology and what that has done and what that means and what we can do. Next month, we'll be talking specifically about our appropriate technology manifesto. We have appropriate technology declaration that you can find on our website. And we have recently published a book called Appropriate Technology Manifesto that's a collection of chapters by our different INAT members with regarding to different areas of appropriate technology and what we must do in terms of bringing it into fruition. But we really want to request from those here and from those that view this video later, and even you to reach out to other friends to request topics, but also to apply to present seminars yourself. So this collage sort of places appropriate technology in the center of many of the areas that we're concerned with. All of us have been concerned with developing countries, the development in countries that have been historically underdeveloped. But you see at the top of this collage, water systems, because water, clean water is so central to the development of any people. And so we see technologies associated with water as being key, just as we see solar, we see issues with regards to information, all being part of this. So this collage is reflective of the kind of work we intend to do and have been doing. Last month, I mentioned this in other books, but I wanted to key back on this book, Limits to Growth, which was written in 1972, commissioned by the Club of Rome. And it was done by a group of scientists, economists at MIT. And it was instrumental in my understanding and my development of both how the world works and the limitations we face. And it was this book that really sort of brought to a lot of people's attention the fact that we really needed to look closely at what we were doing on a global scale, because the planet is limited. It's limited in space. It's limited in terms of the resources it has. And recognizing that at this point in history, so much of what is going on is going at an exponential pace. This is the exponential growth of industries, the exponential growth in population, the exponential generation of waste. So what we're going to do is in the future become so important so that we just don't wreck the planet and make life miserable for future generations. And we see central to this is us advocating and pushing more for appropriate technologies. So this is a list of inappropriate technologies. At the top of this list is military technology, and that's the focus of today's seminar. But also, we can look and reflect on this massive amount of billions of dollars that are being spent on missions to Mars and how it's been hyped and really how it's inappropriate given of the things that we have not accomplished in terms of satisfying basic needs and human rights of billions here on this planet. Offshore oil drilling. We've read about the devastations in terms of oil spills and the lives lost and the loss of animal life in terms of these offshore oil spills as a result of this. Toxic and non-degradable plastics. We know that there's this collection of plastic waste that goes for miles that's in the middle of the ocean because it's toxic and non-degradable. We know that there are many streams and rivers and lakes that have been affected by this. So these are things that we see as inappropriate. Lastly, I have on this list the whole practice of fracking and the policies associated with allowing companies to do this fracking in terms of searching for more petroleum products. So this is just an example to give the context that we're working in terms of a world where we're overwhelmed by inappropriate technology, but is clearly that obvious that we need to focus more on appropriate technologies. This gives an example of how so much resources are spent on the appropriate technology. You see that this just speaks to how all the talk that's given to renewable energies, the global subsidies for those have been 121 billion, while in contrast, the G20 alone has provided the fossil fuel industry with over $452 billion in support of different sources. Now I want to shift to this whole idea of conquest and how out of it emerged conquest mentality. From the offset of humanity, we had isolated communities that were small family tribal relationships, clans that operated in isolation, largely in a communal fashion. Because we realized that communalism was the first way that communities operated, where they operated dividing up the responsibility and dividing up what they were able to gain. But this was, in many instances, a very meager life. And what offset from that was that many of these communities who encountered others and they found themselves wanting came into conflict. And this is what really brought in the first arena of conquest, where neighboring clans with a shortage of resources or with the desire to have more resources, basically had conflict and wars with their neighbors. And this, as I indicated, was primarily neighboring territories. And during this, what we found that people were basically incorporated into the broader conquering area. And this is where, if we look at even not the early millenniums, but if we look at those empires that were developed from the Greek Empire, Roman or Ottoman empires, Mughal empires, that these were empires that had used the conquest approach, but they basically expanded geographically to the neighboring areas and incorporated those areas culturally. But what we recognize in this expansion, that these were the first cases of mass production of technology. The first cases of mass production of technology were military. And this is where they had to basically craft, thousands of swords or shields or tens of thousands of arrows so that they could then extend in terms of these conquests. But in these situations, the military technology was very low scale and was generally comparable amongst warring areas. But what we saw was this swift advance in technologies of war. And this became very evident with the conquest of overseas territories, because what we saw with the trans-ocean adventures in terms of conquest, that European conquerors found themselves in lands that were quite foreign from what they were accustomed to, people who were quite different, and people whose technology was quite inferior to what they would have. So in conquering people like this is what offset this notion of considering them inferior versus the earlier conquest. And this led to genocide and displacement of large populations. We saw this in the Americas, we saw this in Australia, we saw this in parts of Asia. And this brought on a massive extraction of natural resources. The conquistadors out of Spain and Portugal that came to the Americas in search of gold and silver and left with tons of this and brought enslaved people to Europe. This brought a massive amount of wealth to Europe. And it was this all due because of this attitude of conquest that was further fueled by the fact that they were encountering a people that was quite different, and they could then consider them inferior or less human and justify the expansion of this conquest attitude. In terms of technology, I want to highlight that technology of warships, because this was so instrumental in this process of expansion. Once they realized that they could sail to a further part of the world that was less populated or had people who did not have the technology or the ability to defend themselves as those that they encountered in Europe. We saw this massive expansion by European countries in terms of conquest. And I've highlighted here that how in 1805, uh, a typical ship was 3,500 tons and had 100 cannons. This was in 1805, and it spoke to the level of production, the level of technology development, and the emphasis on a one single apparatus at that time, and this was warships. We see that a century later, that a typical ship expanded to 20,000 tons and had 12-inch guns that could shoot these 850-pound shells 12 miles and the cost of $300 million. So we can then jump forward to the UK sort of relinquishing their dominance in terms of the seas to the US. And in 2015, the US had committed to spending $348 billion in the next 10 years to nuclear weapons, including 12 nuclear submarines, each of which were $8 billion. So this is just a massive amount of money that's going into just one area with regards to technology, but it's an area that was instrumental in controlling the world and controlling this conquest process to maintaining the ability to extract resources and dominate people. Last year, the USS Gerald R. Ford weighed in at 100,000 tons and was built at a cost of $18.5 billion, and it became the most expensive warship ever. And it's today having problems in terms of different issues with regards to the development of aspects of it. So this just shows the wastefulness and the unproductive nature of military spending. So this graphic is to just show you the four vehicles I mentioned. The earliest in 1805, the British in 1906. This is an example of atomic submarines, and this is the Gerald Ford aircraft carrier that we mentioned is the most expensive ship sailing the ocean. So what this speaks to from the offset in terms of this massive transocean adventures that set on capitalism and and sort of launched this whole effort towards weapons development is part of capitalist militarism. What we're going to look at is the mass production of weapons, the role of the conquest mentality more broadly, the menace of AFRICOM, this is the African Command, and look also at the military industrial complex itself. So the conquest mentality, I've sort of illustrated with pictures and facts how this drove military development across the sea in terms of battleships, but it also dealt with militarism in land, and then after that, militarism in terms of the air, from airplanes to jets to spacecraft that travel outside of the orbit of the Earth. Secondly, it speaks to the conquest of spaces. And I've defined this in terms of two areas. One is the spaces, the actual geographic land spaces that we saw were very key part of the conquest, and that when these European adventurers came to other places that they saw as foreign, they call themselves taming the frontier, and they ignored the indigenous people. And it was a matter of wrecking the land, using this land, either extracting the resources from it or reshaping it for their interest. But also in terms of the conquest of spaces, we see this notion of space conquest itself away from the planet Earth, going from the fact that we could first orbit the Earth and travel to moon and travel or send aircraft, a spacecraft to Mars and beyond. So it's this intrigue with this space conquest that we see also exhibited in terms of the culture that is developed through books, through films, through TV shows, and even through the video games. Next, I have on there the whole notion of the conquest of Adam that we'll talk about, the conquest of the genome, and the conquest of nature itself. In terms of the conquest of the atom, what do I mean? I mean the splitting of the atom and the development of nuclear uh, arms that were a result of that. The Manhattan Project was developed by the US in 1939 in an effort to, in a race basically, with Germany to be able to split the atom and develop the first atomic bomb, an atomic weapon. And what was unique about this, that it drew on scientists around the world. And at the peak, it had over 130,000 workers, a lot of them engineers and scientists at multiple locations across the US that were engaged in this project. And by the end of the war, when the project ended, after having exploded 2 atomic bombs in Japan, it came to a cost of $2.2 billion. We see also, in terms of this conquest of the atom, the continuation of nuclear testing that has devastated several islands in the Pacific because of the testing there. And what we saw also at post-World War II is this atomic weapons stockpiling that exists even today. In fact, at one point there was some halt on this and some moratorium, but we see now that this is even ending and that we anticipate the US and others will be more engaged in producing more atomic weapons. Last I have on this list of the conquest of the atom refers to the colliders or the different devices that they have to actually split the atom. And CERN, which is a research center in Switzerland that's jointly operated by several European countries with contributions with the US, has built the largest of these colliders. It took 10 years to build it and $4.7 billion. But what is also amazing is that it operates on a budget of over $1 billion. And this is just to investigate the smashing of the atom and the uncovering of different particles. And to their credit, what have they accomplished? They uncovered 3 particles in the lifetime of this. So this is a question of wastefulness, the conquest of space. I mentioned that in terms of claiming territories, that we see that this overseas colonization process was much more damaging than when you saw conquest within neighboring states. And because of this attitude toward the people who were quite foreign to them, it resulted in genocide and displacements of large populations. We can see that today most historically in what is called the United States and Canada. It also reshaped the whole landscape. When people came from Europe, they ignored the geographics and demographics that were there by indigenous people and laid waste to whole areas in order to reshape that in terms of how they wanted to use the land, either for lumber mills, lumber production in terms of lumber being shipped to Europe, or for mining operations, or for large farming operations, as we saw that took place in the South in the US during this early parts of the 18th century, particularly, in which they reshaped the whole landscape to build plantations, which operated under the slave labor of Africans. So this claiming of territories and this reshaping of the space is an instrumental part in the conquest of space. The last part of this is outer space is the last frontier. And many of us were memorized by Star Trek and Star Wars is this whole effort in terms of idealized notion of what it was like to go into space. But we see that because of this conquest mentality that is so overwhelming people and their senses and taking away so much money that billions have been spent on a senseless space race. And this is continuing on today. We saw most recently this competition to take citizens into outer space that was a very serious patriarchal example of competition between 3 European men, Branson, who was born in the UK, Elon Musk, who was born in South Africa, and Beatles, who was born in the U.S., where because they were able to amass money because being billionaires, capitalists, they chose to use that money not to serve the interests of the people, but to have this senseless competition as to which one of them would be able to take a citizen into outer space first. The conquest of the genome, in terms of the basic uh, biological and chemical patterns that we know of, has taken place in terms of this notion to discover the basic DNA patterns of all species, but particularly humans. And with this is lots of ethical issues that have been overlooked and in regards to what is being done and even considered more in terms of genetic modification. We know that this is not new. It has been something, this genetic modification is something that's been done to plants for years. And people have overlooked it because they say that's just plants. But we see the devastation that some of that has has occurred in terms of what it has done in terms of the inability for natural species of plants to be able to grow once these GMO species have been brought into play. We see the whole issue with regards to the owning and control of these seeds related to this. And this is a key example of the attitude in terms of this, what we call the conquest of nature, that is being used to sort of reshape things. So this is something that we have to look at with regards to this whole conquest within the realm of the genome. Conquest of nature itself, from deforestation for the use of timber and land clearing for various other reasons, from farms to malls, the overuse of land for grazing and farming, which has taken place over the years and left many plots really devastated. The extraction of minerals that has left uh, piles of damaged soil and rock and waste and contaminated waste in a place of where there was uh, operating land. And this has been part of what is done in terms of the desire to extract minerals. So this notion of conquering nature is, we see now with the fracking, we see with this hilltop explosions so that they can extract more and more from the earth. Oil and gas extraction and disregard for the environment, where it has left contaminated waterways and continues to do this, where there have been fires as a result of this, where we mentioned earlier in terms of oil spills that have resulted in the loss of sea life and the destruction of beaches. So all of this is part of the conquest of nature, and why it's all for the profits that a few people are able to gain from this type of adventure. Next, in terms of this military relationship, I wanted to warn of the menace of the African Command. After World War II, the USA had such an extensive military machine and was also into high gear with regards to weapons production, that it used this to set up military commands in Europe and Asia. At that time, it ignored Africa because Africa was under colonial domination by its allies, largely Britain, France, and Portugal. But now, with independence, flag independence at least, of all of Africa, with the exception of Swaziland and the Western Sahara, that you have this rush by the U.S. to set up a comparable command that it has already put in place in Europe and Asia across Africa. And this type of operation, what they do is they link the military presence with the embassies, with the Homeland Security, special policing forces that they put in place in various locations of different countries. And it itself is linked to the European Command and Asian Command, so that you have this global connection of the U.S. military. And this U.S. military is linked itself to the military industrial complex. And this is the industries, a set of industries that are in place that actually produce the weaponry from shells to missiles to planes to the warships that are directly used to set up these operations. And to date, the U.S. data itself admits to having over 750 military bases in at least 80 countries. And as I indicated, this is based on the data that is provided by the U.S. government, and there's speculation that the actual number is much higher. So this military-industrial complex is important for everyone to get a better understanding of militarism under capitalism and how that's emerged and what that means today. At the height of World War II, when there was threat of the Allied forces losing, the U.S. entered the war, and the first thing they did was to convert a number of their factories into weapon factories and build other factories for weapons. And this fueling of weapons is one of the things that swayed the war. But what it left after World War II were weapons factories in place. And they didn't shift back to non-weapons industry. Instead, they chose to maintain that kind of relationship of being the prime weapon producer in the world, and to maintain a conquest mentality that went on into the Cold War. So the U.S. dominates in terms of weapons industry, but it's important to note that what Israel leads in is per capita military production. What that means is Israel, being population-wise a much smaller country with 9 million people, that there's more money spent per citizen on weapons military production than anywhere else. So what we found is that we have contracts to destroy. In other words, military companies basically are contracted to provide weapons that are then used in the conflicts. For instance, what we see now taking place in Palestine, because the U.S. provides over $3.7 billion a year in weapons to Israel. They're able to use those weapons in addition to the ones that they themselves build and pay for to destroy. And what happens after that? Then contracts are issued to rebuild the infrastructure. We saw this operation quite clearly in the destruction and rebuilding in Iraq, where many of the companies that were associated with the rebuilding, like Bechtel, were closely related to the same people who had so strongly supported the destruction to begin with. So this becomes a way of making money by destroying and making money by rebuilding. What has to happen then is you have more military operations, is that you have to both replenish your armed forces, those soldiers who are damaged or killed, as well as the military technology. So this becomes a profitable venture for those that are involved in the military industrial complex. We also see the global selling of weapons, both officially, because officially the U.S. is one of the biggest sellers of weapons, but we know that there's many illegal weapon sales going on, and this is why you have some of the conflicts that we see existing in Africa, that these groups that have got weapons and ammunition and on an illegal basis. So we want to look now at the whole issue with research funding trends. By seeing the role the conquest mentality plays in terms of shaping how policy is set and how money is spent, we want to then reflect on the fact that these dominant countries like the U.S., who spends takes up 40% of the global budget with regards to world armaments, that the research trends of these dominant countries affect the world. Major research grants determine the direction that different universities and other institutions go with regards to both their research and their publications that are linked to that. So this shapes, in turn, the whole world, because those countries that are dominated in publications are then cited by others, and that means that smaller or poor countries sort of follow suit in terms of much of the research that goes on. So the monies for military and space research impact research globally. At most universities in the US, a large part of the research in the sciences and the engineering fields are funded by Department of Defense, the Naval Research Lab, the Army Research Lab, and it goes on because each of these units have their own research budgets that they then uh, sort of hand out to professors, and professors buy into this because they then get to use this money to bring in students to do the research. And it's all for the bidding of this military industrial complex. So we know that the U.S. Dominates with regards to funding, but by being the dominant player, this impacts global research and the whole publication cycle. So the U.S. military and NASA are major funding sources for research uh, across the university spectrum. This is a few facts with regards to military technology. The U.S. funding for military research and development rose by 24%. That's almost one quarter between this period of 2012 and 2021. We saw in 2022, the U.S. arms exports representing 40% of the world total, which exceeded over 14.5 billion US dollars, which represented $43 per citizen. I mentioned earlier how Israel was the highest arms exporter per citizen with $91 per citizen of its 9 million people. We see just last year, the U.S. pledging 45 billion in military aid to the Ukraine. So this means more for the military industrial complex, because that's really who's benefiting from it, while the people in the war zone are the ones suffering. Uh, this was actually last month when Biden delivered to Congress this bill requesting $105 billion for military aid for Israel and the Ukraine. So the beat goes on in terms of this request for more funding and more military aid across the board. So this is a graphic that shows just compares the different countries. So you have the United States and that in 2021 spent 877 billion, and then the combined defense spending, China, Russia, India, Saudi Arabia, UK on down, was less than that. So this notion of somehow having to spend more money to keep up with China or Russia is ludicrous if we just look at the ridiculous amount that's being spent by the US Department of Defense. And here, 2023, the budget was $1.52 trillion distributed over 6 of its subcomponents. So within the budget request, we see 145 billion just for research, development, and evaluation, and another 170 billion for procurement, and this is the upcoming year. So as an alternative to this, we see that it's important for us to engage in socially relevant research and to challenge ourselves and to challenge those around us with regards to the whole direction of research. And it's easy to do this by asking very simple questions. Will your research advance humanity? Will it improve the well-being of the planet? Does it provide services to the people? Will it advance culture and even our leisure time? And in regards to the workplace and research, how will your research advance the economy in the workplace? Will it grow the economy by being productive? Will it improve the particular workspace, make it safer, more enjoyable? Will it create new jobs? So the challenge for us is to engage in this query with ourselves first, with those around us that are engaged in our workspace, but more broadly within our nations to question the policy that's in place with regards to research. Is it socially relevant? The last part I wanted to look at is what to do. And we spoke of decolonization. Firstly, looking at decolonization within the university space. And if we do that, we'll see that we need to look at the curriculum itself, how it's shaped. We need to look at the research agenda. How is the research agenda established by a university? Is it just based on what professors can go out and get monies from whoever? Enhancing student and staff commitment to community engagement. If our students and staff are committed more to community engagement, that's where we can tie in the whole point of having technologies that empower people. sharing a decolonizing agenda with other institutions. So if as institution takes this on and seriously looks at how to decolonize its environment and doesn't just do this in isolation, but shares it with other educational institutions as well as the secondary schools that are feeders into its university, it can be much more effective. Secondly, decolonizing communities. We realize that industry and government must shift away from this conquest mentality. This is key and has to be something that's done at all levels within our community. Development must be in harmony with nature. The purpose of humanity is not to conquer nature or to tame the wilderness, but is in fact to be in harmony with nature so that nature can thrive as well as human can. So in shifting technology policy, we realize that we have to view the concerned citizen as the primary stakeholder, and we have to reach out and sort of express what is needed and what is going on to the general public, because they have to be pushed to impact policy change. Next month, when we deal with the appropriate technology manifesto, we'll talk much more about the different stakeholders. INAT is determined to impact policy through public education on appropriate technology needs, as well as explaining the inappropriate technology and the damage that it's caused. And that's a lot about what we're talking about today. So impacting stakeholders is key. We realize those stakeholders in the university have to be held accountable. It's important to appeal to the ethical principles that universities hold high in terms of how they've set out their vision, and to call them to respect our environment and play a role in the decolonization of higher education. At these institutions, we're engaged in a range of fields that are directly related to studying the well-being of the planet. And it's important that those academics play a role in terms of educating the broader public in terms of that. Holding a government accountable. The government is what establishes these policies, and a lot of these policies are come with subsidies in particular industries. We pointed out earlier the massive amount of subsidies that are given to the oil-related industries as compared to renewable energy. So we must push our governments to represent the interests of the people in our environment. Our fiscal decisions must be economically sustainable and in line with safeguarding the well-being of Mother Earth. We must hold industry accountable. We know that industry has been responsible for a massive amount of damage to the environment, and has even themselves come to recognize that approach to circular economy instead of linear economy will eliminate a lot of the waste and be much more productive. And we also realized that we had to push industry to focus more on productive labor, which will reduce alienation and environmental damage. So lastly, let's look at these alternatives to military spending. The reduction of spending on these unproductive technologies that we've highlighted, from weapons development to the space race to nuclear research and testing, will provide billions of dollars that could be used for productive efforts. These productive efforts could be funding of free education, funding of free public health care, extending these to the poorest of the poor. It also can be involved in funding for research directed toward the people's needs that we've talked about in terms of appropriate technologies. So we realize that the key is the shifting here from unproductive technologies to meeting the needs of the people. Conclusions. I have three here. First, we recognize that the conquest mentality has become a pervasive aspect of capitalism. It's contributed to numerous wars, massive wars that we see now taking place in Ukraine, to what we see in terms of the massive destruction of Palestine, to what we see historically in the past in terms of Iraq, and even earlier that what we talked about in terms of even World War II. It's responsible for a massive amount of unproductive labor. And what I mean by this is those involved in everything from doing the research to build better bombs, supposedly, to those actually building the bombs. This is labor that does nothing in terms of putting bread on anyone's table or providing any health care or providing any clothes or any shelter for people. It's not productive but destructive labor. And it's this general misdirection of technology, research and development and deployment is all part of and fueled by this conquest mentality. The second conclusion is moving from a society dominated by inappropriate technology and this conquest mentality requires ending capitalism because it's so linked in terms of this conquest mentality and capitalism and how it operates itself on the profit motive. Thirdly, it is responsibility of all citizens to work toward a paradigm shift that will lead to empowering the most disadvantaged. And we see one key is promoting appropriate technology. So at this point, I'm opening it for questions that any of you may have.
At the moment, the economics of this system damages the environment and damages employment and damages also human relations. So how do we actually then use a new approach? A new appropriate approach is a very interesting idea you did. Albert Einstein said, never regard your study as a duty, but see it as an inviolable opportunity to learn the liberating beauty of the intellect for your own personal joy and for the profit of the community for which your latter work will belong.
Thank you. Agata, go ahead.
Thank you, John, for this informative presentation. I was particularly interested in one of your slides that showed a number of slides, but this one showed the spending of the US alone exceeding so many countries, from the old clique, the old conquerors, to the new ones. So that, as you rightly said, refutes the argument that the U.S. Puts to the American public, that we are spending this much because we are in a race with China, and which clearly here shows that their spending far much exceeds all these countries put together. So I find that quite interesting. There was another slide where you said that just recently, last month or last week, I can't remember, you said that President Biden asked Congress for more than 100 billion for Ukraine and Israel. So my question here is, 105 billion for aid, so military aid. The word aid, that means they are giving them this for free, this military equipment to Israel and Ukraine. So how does this economy works? So if aid means subsidized or free military equipment to countries they want to support, how does the revenue comes back? Is it because they are going to be engaging these countries and other countries to buy more weapons to, fortify themselves, and therefore the military industry in the US will, of course, then make more weapons, and basically the money goes in terms of taxes and the revenues into the US national budget? How does this cycle works, given that us from the outside also are aware of the lobby the military industry or the arm industry in the U.S., the power it has. For example, in terms of how the U.S. has never been able really I mean, restrict the ownership of arms, carrying arms, and always what we hear is that it is difficult to do so because of the military or the arms industry is so powerful, has got a powerful lobby. So I want you to elaborate a little bit about how that works. I mean, if there was a slide also on not just on spending, but on how much revenue does the military complex alone puts into the national budget. Maybe we could also understand the economic motivations behind all this. Thank you. I have another question, but I will stop here for now.
Okay, let me deal with the first part that's a little easier. And that's the part that reflects the U.S. attitude in spending with regards to private arms. I mean, the U.S. has there are more guns in the U.S. than people in terms of the hands of people. You know, it's the only country in the world that, you know, 350 something million people, and they're more, you know, guns, I mean, hand arms and rifles that are in people's houses, because some people have like 10, 20 guns in their house. And that attitude actually stems from the whole conquest, you know, that was initiated by the creation of the U.S. and was placed into the Constitution, this right to bear arms, as they call it, which so that you have this strong National Rifle Association movement that's about the individual owning of guns, that's linked to this notion of the right to bear arms. But that attitude that is part of the broader conquest attitude that's probably most unique in the U.S. But it fuels this whole attitude of the importance of armaments, which is why so much of the population in the U.S. can feel there's nothing wrong with the fact that you have this massive amount of money plowed into to the manufacturing of military equipment, and then in this case, at this bottom of this slide, $105 billion of aid being requested to 2 countries. And while some of this aid is, you know, has flags associated with it in terms of have to be purchases, and I mentioned that in terms of the earlier part on this slide when it talks about U.S. arms export rating 40% of the world total, this is largely sales of arms to any countries from Saudi Arabia to some of its European partners. So they make money from selling to other countries, but they make money in terms of the military industrial complex. Those companies like Boeing and Raytheon also make money when Congress passes a bill like this, $105 billion, to actually give weapons to Israel or Ukraine. And that money basically it means it's being paid by the taxpayer. But there's this willingness to do it in the U.S. because of, as I mentioned, this conquest mentality that drops all the way down to the individual level of owning guns, to more broadly this notion that somehow this is needed to so-called protect the free world. So this kind of attitude is linked very much, as I indicated, to the conquest mentality, because we're talking about areas like this in terms of Israel, which basically occupies Palestine in terms of it as a state only being created in 1948. It actually, at the end of Obama's term, he passed a bill that gave $37 billion over a 10-year period, which still hasn't ended, so that each year the U.S. has been given $3.7 billion to Israel in military aid, and not to mention the aid that it gives to in terms of non-military aid. So this is what we're faced with, and the U.S. is able to do it because of the low level of consciousness of its citizens in general that have been duped into thinking that this is a good thing to have their congressmen send $105 billion worth of military aid to Israel and Ukraine. And it's also possible because the way the U.S. dominates economically with the U.S. dollar. So what it basically is doing is it's increasing the debt that the country has, and is over several trillion dollars in debt. So in $105 billion worth of military aid, that means these military companies get the money because it's not $105 billion going to Israel and Ukraine. They're getting shipped rockets and bullets to tanks, and that money is going actually to the military industrial complex that is making it in the U.S. But how is the money really generated? Is actually money being printed by the U.S. government and increasing the U.S. debt because it's non-productive. There's no selling of wheat or selling of oil or iPhones or anything involved in the equation where people are actually getting something good from it. So this is the whole dynamic that's very, very unfortunate, and why we see it so important for people to understand the conquest mentality and to educate others and move away from this inappropriate technology and this wasteful labor that's involved in generating and distributing inappropriate technology.
Being now in a country that is going through war, I mean, this presentation is right on time because as someone who had no clue about the different sounds of missiles or the different technologies that are used in war, I have become more and more knowledgeable just by hearing and reading and about what people are saying. So we have seen since the war started in April that both parties to the war, which is the Sudan military, the Sudan Armed Forces, and the Rapid Support Forces, they have both managed to get over time more sophisticated weapons, and the weapons are coming from different places through Haftar in Libya, through the Libyan deserts and from Western Sudan, through Chad, from Egypt. That's so each one. I mean, the Haftar and through Chad is being, as some reports have found out, is coming from the UAE or financed, and the Egyptians and others are helping the Sudan Armed Forces. So we have seen like an arms race just in these 8 months, 9 months of war. And I also know that arm race goes into a surge after wars. So after World War I and World War II, there was a surge in arms development in this complex. So of course I am worried about after the war stops here in Sudan, that we will see that that we are spending money back into developing, military technology, because we do have an in-house military technology development. I mean, not sophisticated, but there is still some development, some technology development. So I'm just worried that this is where we will be going after the war. Instead of spending all our money, really should be going into rebuilding the infrastructure that was destroyed and restoring, the lives of people. So it's just so sad. So I think, we need more of these topics to basically be able to, as citizens, to be aware of how we can, I mean, really be vigilant of what might be happening after the war, and be able to, I mean, influence policy if we are aware, of course. So, I mean, it's not really a question, but it's just thoughts coming from the situation that we are currently going.
Thank you, Gada. I think that's so important, and it's also, I think, a good note to end our webinar on, in terms of really looking at the reality in a very key place in Africa, and you have just highlighted some of the importance of reality in terms of what's going on with that. And thank you for sharing that. And I think that may even be something we can look at in the future in terms of linking into a seminar, because as you indicated, we saw at the end of World War II how that devastation led to that, and we see with the destruction of Libya, in terms of that effort, that it just has left a quagmire with weapons flowing back and forth, and different forces fighting each other, similar to when the U.S. aided by Ethiopia disrupted the development in Somalia, and left that in a divided situation, and with different forces competing and getting weapons even to date. So I think these are all areas that we should look at in terms of